Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the filmmakers' collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. Today we're tossing out a quick episode to update listeners on the current status of public media. In short, it ain't good. If you're a regular listener to Making Media Now, you probably know that over the more than 150 episodes we've produced, a sizable chunk of them involve conversations with documentary filmmakers whose work was broadcast on public media outlets like PBS. Much of the reason these documentaries have found a home at places like PBS is because they deal with important issues that impact the health of our democracy, the health of our economy, our natural environment, the rights of marginalized groups, and often compelling human interest stories that the commercial broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, fear won't attract a big enough audience to sell to advertisers. That's not to say that thoughtful, well-made, and illuminating documentaries can't be found on commercial broadcast networks or subscription-funded streaming platforms like Netflix, Apple TV, or Amazon Prime. But public media is often the last bastion of informational and educational programming that is, or was, available to all, free of charge and free of advertiser oversight. On August 1st, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting announced that it would shut down after nearly 6 decades of service. In the aftermath of the announcement, I read and I heard lots of concern and no small amount of confusion about what that means and why it matters. Lucky for me, later on that same day, I read in the online publication Vulture an extremely helpful overview of what CPB is and how its relationship to public media works, written by journalist Nicholas Quah. So I thought I'd take some time to share some excerpts from that article to help those concerned understand exactly where things stand. The article, which I've linked to in our episode notes, is titled "The Future of Public Media Looks Rocky." Making Media Now is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum, from providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs. Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. The Future of Public Media Looks Rocky by Nicholas Quah. On Friday, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting announced it would shut down after nearly 6 decades of service. The move follows Congress's decision to claw back $1.1 billion in previously allocated public media funding as part of a larger rescission bill, a development that some hardline conservatives had been trying to pull off for years. It finally happened under a Trump administration that's basically had the entire Republican Party under his thumb. Earlier this week, the Senate Appropriations Committee also declined to include any new funding in upcoming fiscal budget, effectively amounting to a full defunding of public media. So, how big a deal is this? Well, it's massive. So, what is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? The CPB is a nonprofit organization whose entire purpose is to support the public broadcasting ecosystem, which encompasses more than 1,500 public radio and television stations across the United States. It does this by proportionally distributing federal public media funding based on a grant system. Bigger stations tend to get bigger grants. Smaller stations get smaller grants. The body was established in 1967 through the Public Broadcasting Act, which was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, and its creation was essential to the founding of NPR and PBS a few years later. The whole idea was to foster programming that isn't commercially viable, but remains culturally and educationally valuable. So yes, things like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Arthur, and Sesame Street, but also national news programs like PBS NewsHour. Beyond programming, the CPB also helps keep the lights on for radio stations in rural communities, areas that normal media companies can't viably serve and turn a profit from. The existence of these stations is important beyond simply providing nutritious content. They also distribute information during emergencies. KEDT, for instance, which serves a good chunk of South Texas, was the only continuously running station during Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Hovering above all this is a related belief in promoting regionalism as a hedge against the flattening influence of corporate media consolidation. So the CPB officially announcing that it's shutting down this week is a natural outcome of Congress effectively defunding public media. Without any federal monies to distribute, they actually don't have a reason for being. So how does CPB's closure affect public media as we know it? On a base level, the closure of the CPB as an outcome of Congress clawing back its funding weakens public media on a systemic level. Think about the public media ecosystem as a vast network of television and radio stations serving as distribution points for its content and educationally minded ethos. Not all stations are sized equally because not all of the communities they serve are shaped equally. Naturally, WNYC is larger and richer because New York City is massive and full of potential donors with deeper pockets, while New Hampshire Public Radio is smaller because the community it serves is a fraction of the size. As a result, the effects of the defunding will be uneven. Larger public radio and larger public television stations tend to be less dependent on federal funding compared to smaller ones. For example, New York Public Radio, which operates WNYC, and KPCC, the largest public radio station in the Los Angeles area, both rely on the CPB for only 4% of their most recent annual budgets. They get the rest of their revenue from a mix of direct donations, sponsorships, merchandise sales, and so forth. But something like, say, Boise State Public Radio, which serves the largest city in Idaho, relies on federal funding for 20% of its budget. And we're not necessarily talking about millions of dollars in CPB support here. Marfa Public Radio in Texas, for instance, which is deeply dependent on federal funding, is losing $463,000 from its operating budget due to the cuts. It's also important to keep in mind that the public media system was already struggling even before this point, for the same reasons that profit-seeking media companies have had a rough decade. Disruptive technological shifts, the rise of internet platforms, streaming, and the ever-growing power of tech giants that will suck up all the advertising money. Growing inequality that further consolidates power and capital in the hands of a few companies, an increasingly tenuous macroeconomic picture, and so forth. Most, if not all, of these stations were already running on tight margins, such that something like WNYC's 4% allocation can still do a lot, like hiring a new reporter dedicated to keeping tabs on all the shenanigans going on in Albany. What? You think there's enough local newspapers left to do that job? So, here's a common response to these actions. Can't the free market just fill the gap? No. And that's kind of the point. Critics of public media tend to argue from a position that if its programming was so good and so important in the first place, then audience demand would somehow make it commercially viable. And besides, they have all these commercial alternatives. Why not just go to The Daily or Theo Vaughn's podcast or The Daily Wire or the Medea's Touch podcast or the millions of celebrity podcasts or something? But the reason that American public broadcasting was legislated into existence in the first place was because left to the free market, American media companies largely underproduced culturally valuable programming. A couple of years before President Johnson signed the act, FCC Chairman Newton Minow gave his famous Television and the Public Interest speech, in which he decried the sorry state of television at the time. A vast wasteland, he called it. Now, I'm as strident a defender of media as a vast wasteland as anybody. But the fact is, an ideal media ecosystem is one in which audiences have reasonable access to both the highbrow and the lowbrow, the vast wasteland and the substantial. You simply can't have that without federal funding, because there are just some eminently valuable goods and services that a free market won't naturally support. Economists call these public goods for a reason. And if you think there's a lane for profit-seeking companies to attempt to fill the gap, let me put it this way. As NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik pointed out in a recent guest appearance on the Channel's podcast, Bravo was originally founded as a TV channel that would broadcast opera. In 2024, Bravo, a cable network dependent on advertising revenue, saw Real Housewives of Salt Lake City and Real Housewives of Miami claim its 2 top spots. And here's the big question. Is this the end of public media? As we know it, possibly. As a whole, not necessarily. But the future is looking rough. It's all but certain that we'll see closures among smaller stations, especially those in rural areas that are mortally dependent on federal funding with few alternative revenue levers. We'll probably also see some amount of consolidation, as bigger stations may acquire or merge with smaller ones in the same regions. But that still generally means lost jobs, the paring back of services specific to local communities, and a continued sense that the big continue to get bigger at the expense of everyone else. The major public media organizations, that is, national-level programming producers like NPR and PBS, along with larger stations like WNYC, KPCC, GBH, and so on, will persist as they rely more heavily on their diversified revenue sources. But they, too, will grow weaker in other ways. With more station closures, for example, NPR will have fewer buyers for national programs like Morning Edition, and the reduced revenue may in turn impact the quality of its operations. Meanwhile, fewer local stations means less local talent reporting from those areas. There isn't much to be done at the moment other than to cross your fingers, hunker down, and hope that funding will get restored someday down the line when, or if, clearer heads prevail at the governmental level. Until then, we'll have to make do with celebrity podcasts, I guess. That was The Future of Public Media Looks Rocky by Nicholas Quah, published on the Vulture website. Here at Making Media Now, we'll continue to follow the fallout from the funding eliminations and do our best to keep you informed. Thanks for listening.